Any chess player plays with opponent different qualifications and before thinking about the peaks, need to learn to punish for serious mistakes. This is exactly what this series video is for. These are Fischer games. Let the quality fights are not perfect. All of them contain a lot of instructive stuff. Moreover, these parties are few published.
Pawn e2, e4. Pawn e7, e5. Knight g1, f3. Knight b8, c6. Bishop f1, b5. Pawn a7, a6. Bishop b5, a4. Knight g8, f6. Castles kingside. Bishop f8, e7. Rook f1, e1. Pawn d7, d6. Pawn c2, c3. Pawn b7, b5. Bishop a4, b3. Knight c6, a5. Bishop b3, c2. Pawn c7, c5. Pawn d2, d4. Queen d8, c7. Knight b1, d2. Castles kingside. Knight d2, f1.
White performs the classic knight maneuver for the Spanish game.
Knight a5, c6. Knight f1, e3. Rook f8, e8. Knight e3, d5.
White decisively invades the d5 square.
Knight f6 takes knight d5.
As a result of this move, Black loses a pawn. Material balance was maintained. 14. Queen b7.
Pawn e4 takes knight d5. Knight c6, a5. Pawn d4 takes pawn e5. Pawn d6 takes pawn e5. Knight f3 takes pawn e5. Bishop e7, d6. Bishop c1, f4. Bishop c8, b7.
On 18. The bishop takes on e5 was prepared. 19. Queen h5. g6 20. The bishop takes to e5.
bishop d6 takes knight e5. Queen d1 h5. Pawn g7 g6. Bishop f4 takes bishop e5.
Next in the game was
Queen d1 d3. Pawn g7 g6. Queen d3 g3.
threatens with a murderous 21. The knight takes g6.
Rook a8 d8. Knight e5 d3. Knight a5 c4. Pawn b2 b3. Bishop d6 takes bishop f4. Queen g3 takes bishop f4. Queen c7 takes queen f4. Rook e1 takes rook e8. Rook d8 takes rook e8. Knight d3 takes queen f4. Knight c4 a3. Bishop c2 d3. Pawn b5 b4. Pawn c3 takes pawn b4. Pawn c5 takes pawn b4. Bishop d3 f1. Pawn g6 g5.
Trying to win back a pawn on d5, black weakens his position even more. It would have been better to return the knight to the game by 28. Knight b5.
Knight f4 h5. Rook e8 e5. Pawn d5 d6. King g8 f8. Knight h5 f6.
Again threatening ng with a fork and attacking the pawn. White horse and pawn interact quite harmonious.
Rook e5 e6. Rook a1 d1.
The blacks surrendered. If you liked the review, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Further in the game it could be like this.
Bishop b7 c6. Pawn d6 d7. Bishop c6 takes pawn d7. Knight f6 takes bishop d7. King f8 g7. Knight d7, c5. Rook e6, b6. Knight c5 takes pawn a6. Pawn h7, h6. Rook d1, d8. Knight a3, c2. Rook d8, b8. Rook b6 takes rook b8. Knight a6 takes rook b8. King g7, f6. Knight b8, a6. King f6, e5. Bishop f1, d3. Knight c2, a3. Knight a6 takes pawn b4. King e5, d4. Knight b4, c2. King d4 takes bishop d3. Knight c2 takes knight a3. King d3, d4. Knight a3, c4. Pawn f7, f6. Knight c4, d6. King d4, c3. Knight d6, e4. King c3, b4. Knight e4 takes pawn f6. King b4, a3. Pawn g2, g4. King a3, b4. Pawn a2, a4. King b4, c5. Knight f6, g8. King c5, d5. Knight g8 takes pawn h6.
If you liked the review, don't forget to subscribe to the channel.